Hello, my name is Chris Veck, and I'm a Director of Software Engineering at iRobot. I'm glad to be talking to you all today at Silicon Labs Technical Symposium. I do not speak for iRobot or any other company. All views are my own. With that out of the way, today I'll be talking about empathy-driven development, which is how we can use empathy to reduce confusion and to reduce chaos, and also to improve how we communicate with each other and how we work together. Now, this is not a prescriptive talk with specific solutions to specific problems. My goal instead is to introduce you to a new way of thinking about how we can work together. Hopefully, you internalize it and figure out how to apply it to your own specific situations. Let's jump in. So I'll introduce myself briefly, then we'll talk a little bit about being an imposter, and then we'll get into empathy. As I said, my name is Chris Sveck. I went to Purdue University for undergrad and grad school, and I'm a proud Boilermaker. I started my career at AMD, where I designed chips. I did computer architecture there. Then I moved up the hardware-software stack to Silicon Labs, where I worked in Austin in the broadcast division, probably with many of you in this room. My wife and I decided to move to Boston at some point, and I changed over to this small chip company called Ember. And because it's a small world after all, Silicon Labs then bought Ember, and I worked for Silicon Labs a second time on the Zigbee and 802.15.4 stuff. And now I'm a director of software engineering at iRobot. Now, I'm an engineer who loves engineering, but I also love thinking about how we engineer, how we do the things we do. So before we jump into empathy, I want to talk a minute to talk about something that affects the way many of us work. Has anyone here ever heard of imposter syndrome? If not, here is a helpful visual guide. So imposter syndrome is the feeling that you are a fraud. Your company hired you as an accident. Maybe you got lucky at the interview, you got lucky on some of the questions, you kind of snuck in the door. Any success that you've had, you have not earned. You're a fraud, and you are one performance review away from your boss saying, you're fired, you have no idea what you're doing, and everyone else knew that you had no idea what you were doing all along. Now get out. Now, that is kind of harsh, but that is a pretty accurate internal monologue of people who have imposter syndrome. So who is willing to admit, at some point in my career, I have had imposter syndrome? If you're willing to admit it, please raise your hand, keep your hand up. And if you're willing to admit that, yep, I've got imposter syndrome. So I'm willing to admit it. I have had imposter syndrome throughout my career. Now, I can't see the room now, but I want you to keep your hands up. I want you to look around, check out, okay, how many people in the room roughly have it? Now, I've given this talk a number of times at a number of different venues, and every time, at least half the audience raises their hand saying, yep, I feel like an imposter. So it is absolutely freeing to realize that I'm not the only person with imposter syndrome. One way to overcome imposter syndrome is to realize that, wow, a lot of us have it actually. And in fact, many of the best engineers that I've ever worked with will say, yep, I feel like an imposter most of my career. So that's one way to overcome imposter syndrome, realizing that it's far more common than you might have thought. A second way to overcome imposter syndrome is to realize that imposter syndrome is based on a lie. And this is that lie. See if this resonates with you. I know some stuff, but everybody else knows everything that I know and even more. Now, when you look at it like this on the screen, obviously this is a lie, but it's easy to trick ourselves into believing this is the truth. The truth instead is this: I know some stuff, everyone else knows some stuff. Sure, there's some overlap there, but for the most part, we each have our own unique experience and our own unique assumptions and approaches. Over time, your circle will expand and grow, and mine will too, in different ways, and we'll complement each other over time. Realizing that this is the truth is another way to overcome imposter syndrome. A third way to overcome it is to enthusiastically embrace and admit your ignorance. Now, this sounds a little bit silly, but it's true. Admitting ignorance and asking questions when you don't understand something is literally a superpower. Admitting ignorance in public can be scary, I get it, but notice that people can ask questions without bursting into flames or having something terrible happen to them. I completely understand it's hard to admit ignorance and risk feeling dumb and exposed, especially in front of your bosses or managers or peers, but it's something that we can all grow to be more comfortable with over time with practice. Now, as an aside, if your colleagues or your boss make you feel dumb when you ask a question, maybe it's time to find a new team or a new company. Hopefully, however, that is the exception and not the rule. Admitting you don't know something can be scary, but it's the only way to learn something new. You need to clarify what you don't know or you're unsure of. Successful and smart people ask questions, then they learn, and then they deliver. Unsuccessful people stay quiet and they remain ignorant. I believe that the single biggest determinant in doing good work and growing in your career, and really anything in life, is admitting that you don't know something and then learning it. Having the courage to admit your ignorance is a skill and a muscle that we can all build over time. All right, so we've talked about imposter syndrome and we've talked about the importance of admitting your ignorance. Let's move on to the main topic, empathy. Now, I said this isn't a prescriptive talk, and this is not a prescriptive talk. So I want to share my train of thought with you for how I started thinking about empathy and how we work in the first place, in hopes that it'll spark insights that you can use to bring empathy into your own work. So how did I get started on empathy in the first place? It was kind of random, actually. I stumbled onto the concept of empathy while watching a talk by Richard Hamming. So Richard Hamming, he was the inventor of Hamming codes and Hamming distance. He was the ACM founder, and he was the Turing Award winner. Basically, he's an uber geek. And he said, "The more I study programming, the more I understand that I'm looking at human beings. Remember," he said, "write psychological rather than logical. Write so that it can be followed, so that you 5 years later will know what you were doing." Now, he's talking about programming specifically here, but his message applies to all of us who work in technology, not just programming. When I heard this uber geek think about people instead of just code, I thought, oh, okay, he's a smart guy. He's been working a while. He's certainly got a lot of inventions to his name. Maybe I should think more about people and not just technology. My thinking about what we do is that it's made up of two parts. It's made up of tech and it's made up of team. Now, the technology is the physical and the mental stuff that goes into a product. It's the plastic, the metal, the circuit boards, the test fixtures, the code. It's all of what we think of as the engineering part. The team is everything that we humans do to actually make the tech and ship a product. We decide what tech to make, how to build it, how to divide up the work between people and teams, and then how to combine everyone's work back into a final product, how to test it, how to ship it, and how to try to stay sane while doing it. If this picture is too bland for you, here's a couple other options. So pick your favorite tech and team illustration here, and then let's dig into talking about tech first. Now, as engineers, we love technology. We love talking about technology. We love understanding technology. We love making technology. We spend most of our time and energy thinking about how we can get better at technology. Technology is relatively easy for us to discuss and to teach and to learn about. Hardcore tech is interesting to us. It's probably what brought us all here in the first place. When technology doesn't work or when we don't have the tech we need and we need to invent something, we know how to do research. We know how to use trial and error. We know how to refine and define the new tech that we want to invent. Getting it right is hard, but at the end of the day, we know how to create functional technology. I'm not saying it's easy. There's plenty of unsolved problems out there waiting for us, and there always will be. But generally, we know how to tackle technical problems. Functional technology is absolutely necessary for success, but it's not sufficient for shipping great products faster. We have to know how to take the tech that we each create individually and bring it all together into a cohesive product, which brings me back to team. Now, our industry has historically celebrated the lone hacker, a genius trench coat wearing hacker who can hold an entire design in her head while sitting in a dark room typing furiously by herself. Unfortunately, a single lone hacker is no longer sufficient for creating successful products. And so we've got to talk about teams. Now, teams are made up of people with different experience, skills, attitudes, approaches. I mean, I could have just said teams are made up of people because that's what we are. Teams are what decide what tech to build and how to put the tech together. We already know how to solve technical problems. I assert that the biggest bang for the buck in making better products in a better way is for us to focus more on team than tech. Why bother with team? Why bother thinking of other human beings? I assert that if we focus on engineers before engineering, the team before the tech, our products will be more understandable, more maintainable, more extensible, more successful, and more enjoyable to work with. Now, I very intentionally chose the word enjoyable there. We optimize for so many different things in our jobs: code size, manufacturability, PCB metal layers, task length, market risk, financial cost, all the metrics. We should also optimize for engineer happiness. With a hot hiring market, paying attention to employee happiness is a competitive advantage for the company as well. I want to enjoy my work. I assume that you all also want to enjoy your work. So let's think about how we work to see if we can make it a little more enjoyable. To do that, I want us to take a step back and consider, what would you say you do here? What do we do when we're at work? So I think we read and we write code. A lot of us, maybe it's C++ code, maybe it's Verilog, maybe it's Tcl, maybe it's Python. We read and write documentation in all of its forms all day long, PDFs and Word docs and everything else. We read and write test automation processes and test results. We read and write schematics. We read and write email, Slack, text messages, and of course, all the time that we spend talking and listening in meetings. Basically, we communicate all day, every day. We communicate with computers and the compiler and software. We communicate with the people in front of us now, and we communicate with people in the future by writing things down so they can view it later. Including, we write things down for our future selves as well, not just future other people. So I want to ask kind of a bigger picture question. Whose responsibility is communication? And to kind of try to figure that out, I'm going to try a little experiment here. So here goes the experiment. I'm going to try to communicate. Here goes. Tatu syryjnu jako krava. Okay, did I communicate? Did that work? I just thought something and I said it, so therefore I must have communicated, right? Like we're done, right? Oh, no. Okay, you probably didn't understand that. So if you don't understand something, I should probably speak louder and slower, right? That's how you communicate. Okay, I'll try it again. Tatu syryjnu jako krava. All right, I spoke slower and louder, so now we're done. You all get it, right? Oh shoot, no, you all probably don't understand Slovak, do you? Okay, I'll translate that into English. So my dad cut himself like a cow. So therefore, okay, that was in English. I assume most of you speak English, so therefore I must have communicated, right? Well, it turns out that the phrase jako krava, when translated into English, roughly translates as like a cow, but that idiom doesn't even make any sense in English. So even by translating into English, I still haven't really communicated with you. I haven't gotten my point across. This all is a sort of silly example to demonstrate that communication is the responsibility of the communicator, not the communicatee. It's the speaker or writer's job to make sure they are understood. Communication is a big responsibility that we should take seriously and spend time and energy thinking about. Because even when we speak the same language, we can fail to understand each other so easily. We can fail to communicate. Communication requires understanding, and communication without understanding, it's a complete waste of time for both parties, and frankly, it's frustrating. No one wants to deal with that. I came across this quote in the last 6 months or so, and I absolutely love it. The greatest problem with communication is the illusion that it occurred. So often we write something or we say something and we assume that we were understood. We assume that communication occurred. But how often was the communication just an illusion and we actually were not understood? The best way to communicate so your audience understands is to use empathy. And finally, we arrive at the definition for empathy. Empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the thoughts and feeling of others. Or put differently, it's the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Empathy is deeper and more fundamental than mere sympathy. You feel empathy with someone when you've been there and when you've experienced what they've experienced, when you've been in their shoes. You feel sympathy when you haven't. Now, I know that there's probably some skepticism in the room. Empathy, I'm telling you, is not some hippy-dippy, touchy-feely, new age feel-goodery. Empathy is part of basic communication. If you don't have empathy, you cannot hope to communicate with anyone on anything more than a superficial level. If the people you're communicating with don't understand you, then you have failed, not them. And since working together requires good communication, we'd better figure out how to have empathy for each other. We have no hope of fitting all of our wonderful technology together without communication and empathy. Now, you might be surprised at what I'm about to say, but everyone in this room already has plenty of empathy. Even if you're really skeptical about this, I'm telling you, you have empathy. It just might not be empathy for people. As engineers and technologists, we are trained to have empathy for the compiler, for the software we work with, for the computer, for the technology. We will literally ask ourselves out loud, I wonder what the computer's thinking here. And I wonder what the compiler thinks the variable is here in the program. And what does the variable turn into over here? And then we'll ask, why did the design do that? Why is the circuit in this state and not this state? So we will literally play the part of compiler. We will play the part of a computer. We'll play the part of a design in our heads as we think about problems. I think we need to learn how to play the part of fellow human beings as well. Let's go back to that Richard Hammond quote from earlier to see how we can start to think about having empathy for each other. So the quote again is, "The more I study programming, the more I understand that I'm looking at human beings. Remember, write psychological rather than logical, write so that it can be followed, so that you 5 years later will know what you were doing." Now I want to zoom in on that middle part of the quote there. When Hamming says write psychological rather than logical, what he means is you should write with people in mind. You should communicate with people in mind. Write with the humans in mind, thinking about the mental state of the people you're trying to communicate with, rather than just the logical state of the computer that you're trying to communicate with. The most important reader of your code and your documentation and your schematics is someone else. It's another human being. It's not the computer. They don't have your memories. They don't have your experience with this code or this circuit or this test. They don't have your assumptions. They may not even know your jargon. They haven't spent the last day or 2 or 10 struggling with whatever you're struggling with, and they don't have, the internalization you have of whatever problem you're working with. And in 6 months or a year from now, odds are you won't remember all your memories from today either, because too much time has passed. One day you're going to be frustrated by some code and you're going to be cursing whatever fool wrote this confusing mess. You're going to do a version control blame on it, and then you're going to realize the fool who wrote this confusing mess was you about a year ago. So this is a great reason that we need to have empathy for our colleagues and for our future selves. To help you to develop empathy for others and for our future selves, I have a few concrete suggestions for us to try. Suggestion 1, think about your audience. Spend time and energy and real mental energy thinking about your audience. It should not be easy. This should actually require effort. You may even break a little bit of a sweat. Ask yourself, who are your audience? Why are they listening to you in the first place? Why have they come to you for your talk or your documentation or whatever? What do they want to know? What do they want to, what's their goal? What thing are they hoping to do after learning whatever it is they need to learn from you? What do they know and not know that they'll need to learn in order to understand what you're saying, in order to do what you're trying to enable them to do? Do they have any gaps in their knowledge that you need to be aware of, that they won't be able to understand you without closing that gap first? How are they like you? How are they unlike you? Do they have different communication methods or approaches that will work better for them than for you, perhaps? Asking yourself these questions will start to put yourself in other people's shoes. My second suggestion is look at your code or your design and ask yourself, how can I make it easier for a newbie to understand what I just wrote? And also, how could I make it easier for a new hire to find and fix a bug in this code or in this document or in this design? Remember that a new hire or a junior person or someone who's simply new to whatever it is you're talking about, they don't know what you know, and they may not even know what they don't know. Help them out if you can. Assume they're smart and motivated. That's fine to assume, but they just don't know what you know. So try to make it easier for them. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Another important question to ask yourself is, was I clever? And if you were clever, then don't be clever. Brian Kernighan, who's the inventor of Unix, said this in his book, The Elements of Programming Style. Everyone knows that debugging is twice as hard as writing a program in the first place. So if you're as clever as you can be when you write it, how will you ever debug it? And to that, I want to add, and even if you can debug it, chances are other people won't be able to debug it. So this is just it's kind of a pithy, don't be clever thing, but if you can avoid being clever, avoid being clever. Now, sometimes you do have to be clever, which is sometimes required because sometimes you need some performance or you need some aspect of the design needs to be clever because it's a really hard problem. That's fine. Totally, totally fine when appropriate. When that's the case, though, be sure to document the heck out of your cleverness. I recommend having just gobs of comments in whatever type of document you can, explaining why you were having to be clever, what alternatives you tried rather than being clever, and then explain the cleverness as well as you can. I also recommend this book, The Elements of Programming Style, where Brian Kernighan and his co-author, they talk about a lot about writing things for humans rather than writing things for computers. and it goes along well with this talk. If this resonates with you, definitely check out that book. The third suggestion is you should document all questions and answers that you get along the way. If someone asks you a question, if someone has the courage to admit ignorance, they have given you a precious gift. They have told you that your communication can be improved. Answer their question as they ask it in real time, obviously, but also make sure to document the question and the answer for future you and future others. Maybe you add the Q&A as a comment in your code. Maybe you add a few extra sentences in your test spec, or it can be simple as an unordered frequently asked questions that you throw at the end of any wiki page that you're editing. Doesn't matter what it is, but write it down and capture it for the future. Do this when you get questions in hallway conversations, in Slack conversations, in debug sessions, code or design or document reviews. Just document it for the future. The saying goes that if one person has a question, then many other people will have the same question, and that is absolutely true. Documenting Q&A is an easy and inexpensive way to improve and also scale your communication for others. The final two suggestions I have are to share and actively listen. And what I mean by that is when you're working on some new documentation or some new information, sit down with somebody who's new to your material, who might actually use it and then want to learn this information, and explain your work or have them read the document or whatever is appropriate. And then do something a bit different. Ask them to explain it back to you. And then listen, really actively listen. Listen with the intent of understanding what they understand. Do not listen with the intent of replying and filling in the gaps as fast as you can. Instead, listen to discover the gaps between what you tried to communicate and what they actually understood. This takes some effort, but it's going to be very, very helpful for you to understand how well you're communicating and what you can improve. As a kind of a second option for something you can try is you can try after someone explains something to you, you repeat back what you think you heard. This can feel kind of forced at first, but I've gotten used to using this technique all the time, and I find it really helpful. When someone explains something to me, I'll say, thanks for that explanation. Can I repeat back what I think I heard to make sure that we're on the same page? Sometimes I'll get it right, but more often than not, I will have missed something. Maybe they didn't explain it very clearly. Maybe I zoned out. Maybe I didn't get it for some reason. It doesn't matter, but that dialogue, that going back and forth, will then let us fill in the gaps. This is a fantastic way to build mutual understanding. And it's also a great way to build trust that you and your team are in it together. I'm communicating, I want you to understand, and vice versa. We want to all be on the same page as we all learn and try to develop whatever we're developing. As you and your team explain things to each other, everyone needs to get good at saying, I don't understand. For those of you who are senior, very senior in your careers, senior in your roles, I especially look to you to demonstrate the habit of admitting I don't understand and asking questions. This being, if it's modeled by senior people, then junior people can see, this is a safe place. This is a place I can ask questions, I can admit my ignorance, so that we can all learn everything and we can go on to build better things. Having everyone say, I don't understand, and it being a safe environment to do that helps to overcome imposter syndrome. Colleagues will hear your inner thoughts and they'll hear how you think, and that requires trust, to trust each other, to kind of admit our ignorance, but it also builds trust as we do that over time. It builds team relationships. It builds empathy. It builds high-performing teams. The highest performing teams trust each other and know that their team members have their backs. This is a great way to do it. As a bonus, here's another skill that you can think about employing. As you listen to others around you, pay attention, especially when you're in a meeting. Listen to others who are having a dialogue, having an exchange. And when two people are talking, actively ask yourself, are they understanding each other, or are they talking right past each other? Does he think that she thinks and they're kind of not on the same page, or are they actually on the same page? Earlier, I said that admitting ignorance and asking questions when you don't understand something is a superpower. Well, it's also a superpower to notice when others don't understand something and asking questions to make sure everyone understands. This is when empathy really scales up and improves the outcomes for everyone around you. So to summarize my suggestions on how to develop empathy, think about your audience, ask, how could I make it easier for others to understand, and ask, was I clever? Document the Q&A that you get along the way, share what you're communicating, and then actively listen. And then in the end, the profit. I want to end this talk with the quote that I started with. The more I study programming, the more I understand that I'm looking at human beings. Remember, write psychological for other people rather than logical. Write so that it can be followed by other people, so that you, 5 years later, will know what you were doing. I hope that this overview of empathy sparks something in you and will help you work more successfully with others and even your future self. It's a bit hyperbolic to say, but it's also true. Better communication makes everything easier and more enjoyable and more successful, and empathy can get us there. Thank you very much.